Good evening. Hello. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we're going to be speaking to David McCormack about his latest book on Theodor Eicke. Before we get into that, just a quick introduction to Barnthorne Publishing. We are an independent publisher. We've just celebrated our second anniversary. We've got a host of great authors, including David, some of which have wrote multiple books for us. Some are on their first book, and indeed their first book as an author. So we encourage the veterans, as David is, and also the newcomers. So if you've got a title you'd like to discuss with us, a project that's been stewing in the back of your mind, then please reach out through social media or submissions at barnformpublishing.co.uk. So I'm going to hand over to David. Please introduce yourself, David.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invite, and it's great to be part of the Barnthorne family. So I guess I'm one of those veterans, if you like. The Ica book, that was book number 8. I'm currently halfway through writing book number 9, which is a POW based story. And my background, well, it's a long one and slightly complicated, so get ready. I started off my working career as a nurse. Before anybody asks, I was a male nurse. I do get asked that. And I was in nursing for the best part of 10 years, then retrained as a social worker. And then after 15 years, so by this time I'm in my early 40s, I was about to retrain as a podiatrist. And halfway doing through the very long and complicated form, I thought I'd take a break. I read a local newspaper, the Salford Star. Now, those in the UK, you might be aware of Coronation Street. There was an actor called Nigel Pivaro who played Terry Duckworth. He just graduated from the University of Salford with a degree in military history. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I applied for it that very night. I forgot all about podiatry. So I did that between 2006, 2009, stayed on, did a postgraduate degree in museum management, graduated in 2010, just as the new government were coming in and slashed funding for the arts. So there's no jobs in the arts sector. And so I just sent off a speculative letter to Ledger Battlefield Tours, and I got a reply from them many months later, by which time I'd forgotten all about it, and was invited to see the then head guide. And that's what got me into battlefield tour guiding. So that was around 2012. The very first site visit I did was at Sachsenhausen. One of the very first personalities that I talked about was Theodor Eicke. So he's been a big part of my life for quite some time now. And the idea of a book's been kicking around for a while because what I was aware of, it has been written about, but there's no major biography in English up to now. So that's one thing I did want to rectify. And I also wanted to write about him because he was a man of many parts. A career split into two halves, almost perfectly split into two halves. I'm sure that is going to come up during the next hour or so. So that's me. Yeah. So I've always worked with the public. Um, for good or ill, for good or ill. At the moment, it's definitely ill, as I've had a bit of coach flu for the last month. So I'll struggle valiantly through the next hour, and I probably will deserve a medal at the end of this, and I fully expect to get one. So that's me. That's where I basically.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, and I didn't know about yourself that that was your connection to Ica, that that early trip that you did. So yeah, no, it's interesting to know. You mentioned obviously this was your eighth book and you're actively working on number 9. I guess looking back all of those years, then how did the writing journey actually start for you? Like what kind of how did that first book come about?
It started, I think it was around 2003, 2004. I did a series of articles for the Old Armourer magazine, which I'm sure many of us will remember. And I did a series, Italy at War, based around some militaria. Then that developed into a series, Japan at War. I think that was in about 8 parts. And I used some of that when I wrote my dissertation while I was at university. And it was Japanese air defense at the Battle of Midway. That basically became the basis of the book. And it was interesting enough, it was one of my passengers. And I can remember it the last night of a tour. We were sat at the bar of a hotel in Belgium, as you do. She was already an accomplished writer. She writes Victorian crime fiction. I think she's done something like 40 novels. And I was telling her about the articles, about the dissertation, and she said, "Why don't you write a book?" I said, "I've not really thought about that." She said, "You should write a book. You've got all the information there." And I said, "Okay, I will." And I think it was about 6 months later, I emailed her, "I've got a contract." And I emailed her again, "I've written the first chapter. I'm halfway through. I've completed the book." So it was great to sort of, take her through the whole process. And I did sort of mention her in the acknowledgements of the book, because without her, it was Linda, it probably would have never happened. I may have continued to write articles. By that time, I was writing for the International Academic Forum. They're English language publication based in Tokyo. And again, I did a couple of Japanese-based articles, one on General Douglas MacArthur. And again, they both, went into the book as well. And it was going to be a one-off. It really was going to be a one-off. It was going to be, this is it. I've done it. I've done my book. I can now, sit back and say, yes, I've written a book. Then, I was in Berlin on a tour. And I thought, you know what? I know Berlin. I should really write about Berlin. So I ended up doing 4 books on Berlin, 2 battlefield guides, a short history of the year 1945, and a Cold War companion. I did that. I thought, okay, I've done Berlin. Now, what do I do? And it was my then publishers who sort of pushed me into doing something, Japanese orientated again. So I did a book on Japanese tanks and armored warfare. And then came an interesting one. It was a good friend of mine, Gary, down here in Bournemouth. And he phoned me up one night. He said, "David, you're into your history." I said, "I've got some of my dad was in the war. I've got some of his stuff. It's under the kitchen sink in a biscuit tin." "Of course it is. Of course it is." He says, "My dad was a Ukrainian partisan." All sorts of thoughts started going through my head. "Let's have a look, Gary. Let's have a look." So we went down to meet him. He got the old biscuit tin out. Within 30 seconds, I said, "Gary, let's have a cup of tea. You need to sit down. There's a few things I need to tell you. One is your dad wasn't a Ukrainian partisan. He was in the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army. But they were only formed in March 1945. Before that, they were the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division. Your dad was a member of the SS." But I said, "Don't worry, they were a combat unit, and he was very lucky to survive." And what I wanted to do is bring the book out for him, but also his 2 children who are now grown up, who are starting to take an interest. His dad didn't say a lot, not a lot, but there's only one story that really stuck out for Gary, and that was during the withdrawal in May 1945 to the British lines. And Gary's dad told him, "I didn't eat for 2 days. To stave off my hunger pangs, I chewed on the leather of my belt." He still has that belt to that day. So that's a book I was really, really glad to get out for him, for his family, but also to put the record straight as well. Gary's father wasn't a war criminal. He was conscripted at gunpoint. He worked on a farm. He served in Slovakia, Slovenia, and he was still fighting the Red Army on the morning of the 8th of May, 1945. He came over to the UK in 1947 and became a very productive member of society. He was even allowed to marry the year after. So, in a sense, the SS connection, maybe that was a spur as well to writing about Eicke, perhaps. I don't know. But it's all those visits, perhaps, to Dachau, Sachsenhausen. I thought I really must do something on this man, as I talk about him several times a year. So it's a book I was glad to get, I was glad to do. You always worry at first when you start to write a book, is there going to be enough to write about? And I
Mm.
soon realized that that wasn't going to be a problem at all. It really wasn't. So
Yeah, I
that's
think,
at the moment, yes.
yeah, I mean, given obviously we're going to come on to the various kind of threads of of his life. And given in the scheme of things, and spoiler alert, he doesn't survive the war. There is a lot to talk about. But I guess before we get into that, I mean, would you, as you said earlier, there's not really an English account of him. Do you think that's kind of reflects the fact that he didn't survive, unlike maybe other people that did?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, he's killed in action on 26th of February 43, so it's relatively early in the war. If, I do like alternative history. If he had have survived, there's no doubt about it, he would have been one of the major defendants at the first Nuremberg trial. No
Mm,
doubt about it whatsoever. Um, Also, he never really gets anywhere near the top table. He's what I would call middle management at best. So he's not a particularly well-known figure, better known for his role in the concentration camps, but he leaves the concentration camp inspectorate as early as 1937 when he takes up a military career. And his military career is not that well known at all, to be honest, outside specialist circles. So the knowledge of the man isn't there. He's a contemporary of Heinrich, worked alongside Heinrich, not harmoniously, it has to be said. They were great rivals. But as we know, Heinrich doesn't survive the war either, but he had a much higher profile.
mm.
During the war, he has a higher profile. He had direct access to Hitler. Eicke never had that. So he's not quite in that sort of higher tier of middle management, but a very important figure nonetheless. Everything that happened in the camps, everything that will happen later is based on his doctrines, his
Mm.
teaching. Dachau is established as the model camp. Every other camp, to some degree, will follow the Dachau model. So a very important personality.
So how does he find his way to Dachau? You know, what's his early life and career leading up to Dachau?
Almost by accident, um, force of circumstance, if you like. He joins the SS in 1928, so he's not what we would call an early member, although he could justifiably claim to be an old fighter in that he loses his job. He had a very good job working in industrial espionage for IG Farben. He was on a very good wage, by the way, more than double what a skilled worker could get at that time. So he's got a good claim to be an old fighter. But the SS, certainly in the 1920s, it's not what people expect it to be. It's not particularly well run. It's not particularly well organized. It's chaotic. You have a lot of roughnecks. You have a lot of malcontents. You've got a smattering of intellectuals, a smattering of the lower aristocracy, but lots of people like Eicke who've got a grievance against the world. They've got to blame something or somebody for their failures. And it was this grievance, this constant feeling of anger that gets him into trouble. So much trouble, in fact, that Himmler sends him to Italy to look after a colony of exiled SS men, all men like Eicke. And it's only really after Hitler comes to power that he's able to come back to Germany. All's forgiven, at least for a while. But even then, his entry into Dachau, he's not the first commandant of Dachau. That's Hilmar Wackerl. The camp is run is what we would call a wild camp. There's virtually no rules, no regulations. Wackerl runs it as his own personal fiefdom. Murders are carried out regularly. But it's pre-August 1934. Hitler doesn't have complete control yet. The judiciary are still semi-independent, so the murders are investigated. It becomes an absolute catastrophe for Himmler. In that, the SS is in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Wackerl is sacked. He brings Eicke into the job. Why? Eicke was basically, he'd been threatened with obscurity. He'd even been placed in a psychiatric institution for a while by a Gauleiter, Joseph Burkel, who he tried to assassinate. Again, he had a nemesis following nemesis. Burkel was one of his chief nemesis in the early days. And it was Himmler who rescued him. We could say then Himmler is assured of Eicke's loyalty. We could say that Eicke will do anything now to progress his own career and to keep his master happy. So here's a chance at Dachau he can make something of himself. His previous life up to this point has been disappointment following disappointments. He was a career soldier. He joined the army in 1909, served throughout the First World War, didn't really achieve much. He was a paymaster. So the laurels of victory, if you like, never went to him. Denied really promotion, if you like. He was in the police force for a couple of years. Again, wasn't a success. So here's his chance to really make something of himself. And in the SS, men of dubious character, but doers. You didn't need to be a man of good character. Sometimes, as we know, in business, in the military, in any organization, it's not people of good character who also make good leaders. It's movers. And Eicke was a mover. He made things happen. And very quickly, he was able to establish himself within Dachau. And everything, if you like, began to work under his new set of rules and regulations. He changes everything in a
Hmm.
remarkably short time, it has to be said.
So, as you say, probably not the kind of textbook, Nazi on the rise as such. His career's quite checkered. But yeah, he's found himself in that position in Dachau with a lot of responsibility and is able to obviously put his stamp on things, obviously under his paymasters.
Mm.
So, um, how long was he at Dachau for?
He's at Dachau from June 1933 up until late 1937. He joins the concentration camp inspectorate. So for the last couple of years, he's shuttling between Dachau and Sachsenhausen. And when you have the beginnings of the militarization of the SS, he really does start to take to soldiering. And let us say in the last year or so, in the concentration camp inspectorate, he does start to neglect his duties somewhat. So we're only looking at a period of around 4 years, but he does leave an indelible stamp. Now, that's not to say that all contact is broken. Because as we know, one of the features of the early pre-war concentration camps is that they were run as commercial enterprises. The SS will, be deeply involved in this. Places like Dachau, Buchenwald, they will be centres for the distribution of clothing and equipment. So he's able to maintain his contacts for several years afterwards to ensure that his militarized troops get what they need. And he'll do it by any means possible, even theft. And on several occasions, Himmler has to reprimand him very, very strongly, and even reminds him that the psychiatric ward is waiting for him. On one occasion, he says, "I think your nerves are a little bit strained again." And it's a sort of veiled threat. Would you like to go back to the psychiatric ward? So a very difficult subordinate, but typical of the early SS. It might have been chaotic. The whole of Nazi Germany was chaotic, but at the same time, it was very, very dynamic. It was a dog eat dog world. There was he talked a great deal about camaraderie, this feeling of esprit du corps. But that was window dressing. It's dog eat dog. And it's whoever can climb to the top, the fastest, and stay there and jealously guard their prerogatives. And that's something that Ike always did. He was the king of his own little castle, and he guarded that castle jealously. It has to be said right till the very end.
Indeed. So I think it was after the night of the long knives, his role in the
Mm.
concentration camps, it kind of changes at that point. Like what happens in that kind of time of his life?
It changes everything for the SS. It really does. We can't forget as well that the army plays a part in this. So the SS is still a very small organization. It's the army that will supply the transport, the weaponry for the Night of the Long Knives. They then become implicated in political murder. But the Night of the Long Knives, it will diminish greatly the role of the SR, the stormtroopers, and it will enhance greatly the role of the SS. The biggest winner out of this is Himmler. He's allowed to expand the SS. Also for Eicke as well, his prestige is very much raised. He's not a backroom boy during this. He takes a hand, certainly in the murder of Ernst Röhm. It's he and Michael Lippert. These are the two people that are involved directly in Röhm's murder. We have to call it murder. It's what it was. We still don't know who delivered the coup de grace. It could well have been Eicke himself. So he's by no means a sort of an administrator, a paperclip counter. He led by example, always led by example. And he's certainly never shy of meting out punishment to himself, either to prisoners or to his own guard units. Discipline was incredibly harsh. Yet for all that, he was almost revered, if you like. Let's not forget a lot of the original guard units. Again, young men with axes to grind, and he gave them a sense of purpose. He gave them a sense of identity, and it wasn't for nothing that very quickly he became known as Papa Eicke. He was very good actually at looking after some of the younger members of the guard troop. Anybody that their parents had disowned them, he would actually take them into his own house. And so he's actually, maybe in a way, because his own family life was somewhat lacking. He was married with two children, but it wasn't the most harmonious of marriages. So perhaps for the Eicke, the SS, and particularly the Guard troops became a second family. That would be far enhanced by the Night of the Long Knives. By now, the SS, the prestige is high. The stormtroopers, they are on the wane. There's only one way his career is going to go now, and that is up. That is up. And he's well aware of that.
Indeed. As you say, again, interesting that he had been in the military in the First World War. He'd served, and then he's got this weird period of his life where he's obviously with everything going on in Germany pre-Hitler's rise.
Mm.
He then finds himself in this role in the concentration camps, etc. But the military, the kind of the more military side of the role comes back to him at this point at the start of the Second World War.
Yeah.
So he obviously is involved in the Polish campaign
Mm, mm,
and the formation of the SS division
mm.
Totenkopf. So do you want to talk us through that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, the militarization starts as early as 1937. Originally, what we refer to the Waffen SS, the armed SS, was known as the SSVT, Special Troops at the Disposal of the Führer. Now, of course, the army didn't like this because Hitler had promised them, you will be the sole bearer of German arms. And after the destruction of the stormtroopers, they believed that to be the case. So yet here we are, 1937, the creation of special troops. Now, originally, the plan was to use them to quell any sort of internal revolts. However, as we get into 1938, the Sudeten crisis, it's clear that these troops are going to have another role and the training steps up. Now, we have to remember that, pre-war, the SS, the armed SS, it's very small. We're looking at 3 regiments at the time. They don't achieve divisional status until we're actually into the war itself. But for Eicke, he takes to soldiering quite readily. Perhaps now he can be the man that he wanted to be in the so-called Great War. And he does take his responsibilities quite seriously. Now, this is at a time where the army very much distrusts the armed SS. They do everything they can to undermine them. And so for Eicke, what he has to do is impress the army. And he'll do this through a series of military exercises to show them we actually know what we're doing. We actually know what we're doing. However, when they go into action in Poland, there's a lot of criticism from the army again. Criticism is the SS take very heavy casualties. Criticism, the junior officers seem to be out of control. Even Eicke himself, rather a little bit of a gung-ho attitude. But he's still learning at this point. It has to be said, he didn't attend a military academy. He is basically self-taught. And much of the training for his units was in-house. They had some help in the more technical aspects of training, communications, etc., but it was largely in-house. He was very lucky, actually. He had a chap called Count von Montigny, who was a seasoned military professional. But that's about all he has for the moment. However, Montigny will actually succumb to a hemorrhaging stomach ulcer during the French campaign. And so they never quite, get anybody of that standard again. And so we could say there's always an element of amateurishness about the division. And let's not forget where these people come from. They came from the concentration camps. They'd had years of indoctrination. And so they see the enemy beyond the wire as the same as the enemy behind the wire, people to be despised, people to be eliminated, no matter what the means. And certainly in France, the division will be involved in a number of atrocities, most notably l'apparatus, involving British troops. And that stain will remain with them forever. It's quite interesting that once they go into the Soviet Union in June 1941, they never see service on the Western Front again. Possibly partly because of that stain. They'll remain on the Eastern Front until the very end of the war. But as the war goes on, Eicke starts to learn. He'll conduct his own war games. He'll even take tactical signs from maps, and he'll actually play war games in his own office. So he does take things seriously. He's in constant conflict though with the army over equipment, supplies. He's in constant contact with the SS. He's in conflict with everybody. But as he sees it, he's doing the best for his men. He wants reinforcements, but he wants trained troops, not green troops. He wants good equipment. And he'll get it by any means, but he will come into serious conflict with pretty much everybody. And these complaints against him will go as far as Himmler. And so once again, he has to be reprimanded on several occasions. Why does Himmler keep him? Again, he's a doer. He might be an incredibly difficult subordinate, but he gets things done. And certainly by the time the Totenkopf goes into the Soviet Union, they're a far more seasoned unit than they were before, and they are starting to become more professional. That's not to say there's not problems, there are. Every time the division is on the move, they cause the biggest traffic jam in world history, and they will do that on the Leningrad front. Well, Eicke will just decide, I'm not taking the road designated to me. I'm going to go across country. The ground looks hard enough. It was until there was a thaw that night, and his whole division got stuck in the mud. And so he still makes mistakes, rookie mistakes that the army uses ammunition against him. He's his own worst enemy at times. That will always be the case. But on a professional level, he is starting to learn. He really is. But the division will take very, very heavy casualties. I mean, I talk about this a lot when I'm on tour. We think that the early part of Barbarossa, it's the German land forces, crossing a wheat field, crossing a river, destroying a Soviet army, marching on towards Moscow. They were taking huge casualties from day one. In fact, in the first 6 weeks of Barbarossa, the German forces lose as many men, killed, missing, and wounded as they had in the whole of the war up to that point. They are literally winning themselves to death. They really are.
Winding back slightly, so obviously following the invasion of France relatively earlier in the war,
Mm.
there's a bit of inactivity before Barbarossa, and I think it comes across in the book that he almost struggles with that inactivity to some extent.
He really does, because he's got to keep Totenkopf in the limelight. And that's where the action is. However, after the French campaign, again, the division had taken heavy casualties in France. They needed reinforcements, they needed retraining, they needed re-equipping. Yes, they were assigned to coastal defense duties. But as we say, an idle army causes problems, doesn't it? And usually problems of discipline. And there were always disciplinary problems. That said, no more than in any comparable army unit. But for any, group of, service personnel billeted near a, village or town, the temptations are very great. And a lot of his troops succumbed to those temptations. And again, he had to wield an iron rod, which was gripped by an iron glove to keep his men in check. So for him, the best place for them was in the field.
Mhm.
In the field, absolutely.
And obviously, his career having kind of switched from military to obviously after a period of time to the concentration camps, then back to a more military role. With obviously some of the kind of the politics you've mentioned and some of the criticisms, was it ever on the cards that he might go back into the camp kind of management of some kind?
Not once he's a part of the militarized SS. Well, for two reasons, really. One is that he really did take to soldiering. He really did. Two, the system had moved on, and a successor, Richard Glukes, had already been appointed. The two of them would fall out spectacularly, and there were plenty of people within the concentration camp inspectorate that didn't want him back because of his quarrelsome nature. A lot of people in the Reich Security Office, including Heinrich, didn't want him back. So he's got lots of enemies there, and some of them saw it the best place for it is out there in the field, where some of them hoped he would make a spectacular fool of himself, but he didn't. I think he surprised everybody by taking this very, very, very seriously, and possibly for the first time in his life, really pouring his energies into one particular area and really being able to, put his mark on something. And he does that very, very well. He helps to bring a degree of professionalism to this disparate group of desperados who, under any other circumstances, would not have been able to function as a military formation. I think without his presence, the history would have been very different. I think I can imagine the Totenkopf either being wound up or disbanded and absorbed into other units such as the Liebstandarte. And of course, Sepp Dietrich would have only been too happy to do that because all of these, SS divisional commanders, they were all fighting each other to wear the laurel leaves, particularly Dietrich and Eicke. The two of them were very much rivals. Being rivals, they would try and outdo each other at every opportunity. So yeah, I think once he's part of the militarized SS, there's no going back for him. This is his true métier, if you like. This is the man he always wanted to be, and here's his chance to win those laurels, and he does. He'll win the Iron Cross First Class, the Knight's Cross, the Oak Leaves, the Knight's Cross. Within a short space of time, he'll achieve everything that was denied to him during the First World War.
We've got a question from our live audience,
Mm,
and picking up on something you said earlier about the high casualty rates.
mm.
Was that down to poor tactics, the kind of gung-ho attitude, or a case of one thing leading to another, etc.?
It's a little bit of, it's a combination, really. It has to be said, some of it was gung-ho tactics, no doubt about it, certainly from the junior leaders, a lot of which lacked experience and the requisite training. It also has to be said, though, no matter how much the regular army complained about the SS, they were usually glad to have them by their side, and it was usually the SS that were given the most difficult objectives, which by circumstance are going to lead to heavy casualties. So the army will give the SS troops difficult objectives. They then take heavy casualties taking those objectives. Then the army complains, why are your casualties so high? But most of the time, Eicke's troops in particular will take their objectives. So yeah, and that's going to lead to again to a lot of friction between Eicke, the SS, and the army. In that the SS are gaining the laurel leaves, although they don't always appear in the army accounts. That will be rectified later on. But yeah, a lot of it is there is a lack of professionalism in the early campaigns. It's a very steep and a very painful learning curve for all involved, uh, not least Eicke himself. And it's not really until we get into the campaign in the Soviet Union, again, circumstances force upon them, they're going to have to learn quickly. Everybody expected this to be a rerun of the French campaign, but they very quickly learned, yes, Russian armies were surrendering en masse, but other Russian armies, units, were fighting to the last man. This was a different kind of war, one that they'd not really been prepared for. Much of the Totenkopf's training in the run up to Barbarossa actually anticipated a campaign in Iberia. Because we're looking at Operation Felix here, cooperation with the Spanish, which of course never really happened. So even the training, okay, I do a lot in Spain with the Peninsular War. There are some similarities, barren country in the interior, very long distances. So some of the training would have been useful, but they ended up fighting an army that they really had very little knowledge about and a people that they had even less knowledge about.
Hmm. So I guess obviously we kind of touched on it in parts, but so what was the division's role in Barbarossa? How does Ica fit into that and the planning, etc.?
To begin with, a secondary role, which he was incredibly disappointed with. They were given the role of mopping up. So we're looking here at the Northern Front, the Leningrad Front, and it was the army, of course, who would go in. As we know, it's the motorized panzer divisions who lead, the infantry follow. Eicke's division would then go in to mop up. However, resistance is a lot heavier than is expected. And there are gaps in the line that need more than mopping up. So rather than taking part in almost counterinsurgency action, irregular warfare, his unit finds themselves fighting regular Russian troops. And indeed, right from the very beginning, this northern sector, you don't get the great advances that you did in the south. The fighting there is it's far more bitter, and you're up against some very determined opposition. So right from the beginning, his unit is taking casualties. They're involved in some very heavy fighting indeed, given some very difficult objectives to take. As we know, the Soviet Union, it's river after river crossing after river crossing, defended towns, defended villages, each had to be taken in turn. And they do that, but they are winning themselves to death. Gradually, the division is being bled to death. And this is even before the Russian counteroffensive, which will lead eventually to their encirclement at Demyansk. They're already in a poor condition even before the encirclement. But because we're not quite up to the point where these divisions become the Führer's fire brigade yet. That'll come later. But we're at a point where Himmler certainly wishes to maintain the prestige of the armed SS. He certainly doesn't want them withdrawn. The army don't want them withdrawn either. They are starting to recognize the value of these formations. And so they're involved in a campaign that they hadn't really trained for. They're fighting an enemy that they really didn't know, but are starting to know. And this is all part of this steep learning curve and a painful one because of the very high number of casualties that are being inflicted on the division, particularly amongst the junior leaders, which they find very, very hard to replace. And going back to what I said earlier about the early SS, things haven't changed. You still have banditry and competition in the SS. And what Eicke finds is wounded soldiers sent to the rear for convalescence, they don't necessarily get back to his units. They're being poached by other SS formations. So he's losing men in lots and lots of different ways. So he's fighting several battles. He's fighting the Red Army, he's fighting the German army, and he's fighting the SS administration at the same time.
Hmm. Very not the easiest guy to work with by the sound of it.
Almost impossible. One thing I did in the book, I looked at Theophrastus, which was a pupil of Aristotle, and he wrote about character traits, and he came up with 30 character traits. And I went through them all, and Eicke, about 20 of them are applicable to Eicke, all the negative ones. He is the bore. He is the sort of the late learner. He is the self-indulgent man. But a lot of studies about, military leadership, generalship, a lot of studies about business leadership as well. A lot of them have come to the conclusion of it's not necessarily people of character that make good leaders. It's doers. And for all his negative character traits, I mean, he was argumentative. He was almost sort of paranoid about maintaining his own prerogatives. Um, it made him a doer. He got things done. And for that reason alone, Himmler could tolerate him. He was an incredibly unruly subordinate, but he actually got things done and he achieved success. Perhaps where, arguably, nobody else would have been able to do it because nobody else, arguably, was as uncompromising as this man was. Possibly the man for the moment in a difficult situation. It was certainly when times were at their toughest. Some of Ike's better qualities started to come out. He turned out to be a very good organizer. He turned out to be a very good inspirational leader, if you like. That makes him incredibly hard to write about. Because
Mm.
one thing I had to do with this man is to get very close to him, but not so close that I began to be a fan of his. So I employed something, I think it was Professor Richard Gewarth came up with the phrase, cold empathy, getting close, but at the same time, stand back. We can't forget what this man was. He was an absolutely dreadful character, without whom the concentration camp system would have not been what it was. Some of the atrocities committed by his division, maybe wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, we have to say that as a military leader, he was moderately effective. I won't say better than that. He was a moderately good divisional general, I would say, at best. But we have to say, in the Waffen SS as a whole, the standard of the divisions, the standard of leadership, it was on a very broad spectrum, from the highly competent to almost the incompetent. I'd say that Eicke stands somewhere broadly in the middle, broadly in the middle. Possibly one of the reasons why he's not a particularly well-known personality.
Indeed. So before we kind of get onto the kind of the closing chapter, as such, we've got a question again from the audience. You've kind of touched on this, I think, in terms of where he stood in terms of the line of succession and so on. But was he ever a consideration to replace Heydrich, following Heydrich's assassination?
Oh, Lordy Lord, that's a good question. No, no. First of all, the two men absolutely cordially despised each other. Now, there's a contradiction, isn't it? The reason is that Heydrich was responsible for arrests and release. He had no authority within the concentration camps at all. He wanted it. He wanted to break into that system. Ike fought him tooth and nail to retain that prerogative. Certainly by the time Heydrich dies, that's what, June 1942. By that time, Eicke's deeply involved, isn't he, really, with the military side of things. He would have had no interest in it. Plus, he was never a member of the Reich Security Main Office. It was a completely different organization within the SS as a whole, and he wouldn't have been tolerated by it anyway. He had so many enemies
Mm.
within the SS that many of them thought the best place for him is out in the field, where he can cause us a lot less trouble. Let him cause the army trouble instead, which he did a jolly good job. His middle management, he never quite reaches Heydrich status either, it has to be said. Heydrich, he has personal access to Hitler, largely because of his position as Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Eicke never rose to that position. If he wanted access to Hitler, he needed to go through Himmler. And really, the only time he actually got direct access to Hitler for an audience was when he was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. Otherwise, he was never anywhere near that top table. He was too troublesome, too difficult. Better leave him where he is.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought, yeah, Russia's the best place for him. Absolutely.
And so it was to be. So I guess talk us through the kind of the final chapter of his career and life as it was.
Yeah, it's a strange one. Again, this is where some of his better qualities come out. He was actually flown out of the Leningrad area. Actually, his staff car drove over a landmine, and he was very seriously wounded. His foot and leg were shattered, and even when he returned to duty, and we're looking at the best part of 9 months later, he has to walk with a cane, and he has to go back for further operations. Um, when his unit is surrounded at Demyansk, so we're looking here in the wake of the massive Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941, 90,000 German troops, including the Totenkopf, are surrounded at Demyansk. And here, Goering's assurances that he can supply them by air actually partially come off. Now, that'll have later disastrous consequences at Stalingrad, of course. But here in Demyansk, they actually do manage to, mainly supply the troops by air. Much to his anger, Eicke is flown home. Partly one of the reasons is for treatment, partly that Himmler wants him to establish the build-up of a new Totenkopf division. Now, Eicke doesn't like this at all. His argument is quite a valid one. Well, what about the old one that is slowly bleeding to death? And for a while, he actually goes on a partial hunger strike. He eats the same rations that a soldier in the trenches at Demyansk would be eating, which is basically nothing. And Himmler has to step in to stop this. And so it's part of this solidarity that he felt with the troops. And on a daily basis, he's getting dispatches from Demyansk telling him, we're bleeding to death. We're not going to survive that much longer. It's only due to his constant request to be sent back into the line that he finally is. And this is in early 1943. At this point, you've got the beginnings of the spring thaw. Things are starting to lock up. A corridor is about to be established with the cut-off troops. And the circumstances of his death are rather unusual. Again, this is Ike leading from the front. He's not an armchair general. He's not what I would call a chateau general. He spends a lot of time in the frontline positions. He's known to eat the same rations as, the lowest soldier. On this occasion, he hears about, this is now, we're into February 1943 now, about a tank column. And they've been out of contact now for the best part of a day. Now, leading this tank column is his son-in-law. So perhaps here, his decision has been swayed. Now, you'd expect a reconnaissance to be taken out by, of course, one of his officers. He insists on doing it himself. So this is a divisional commander going up in a spotter plane with a pilot and his adjutant into an area that they think is clear of enemy. They don't know 100%. And despite the remonstrations of his staff, he goes ahead. This is Eicke. You don't argue with this man. And they actually spot the tank column. What they don't spot at the time is some Russian troops that are dug in. And as the plane begins its slow descent to land, it comes under heavy anti-aircraft fire, which basically shatters the plane in midair. And what we do know is, again, it's part of this esprit de corps that he'd built up so diligently over the years, that several rescue parties are sent out to recover the body. And eventually, the bodies are recovered. And when it all ends, I think that the press take about a week to release details of his death. And it's the usual, propaganda piece of the time. It's a Hail Mary to one of our, great one of our great personalities. And Hitler even talks about, his unique contributions to the party and the state. But most of those who would have given their condolences to the party and to the family, it would have been done basically with fingers crossed behind their backs because they despised this man, absolutely despised him. And if you contrast that with some of the news that was in the Western press, he basically barely got a footnote in the West because he wasn't a well-known figure. Contrast that with the press reports about Heydrich. Heydrich got a lot of coverage in the West. But Ike wasn't a well-known figure, but he got all the honours that a state could give him because he had to be made into a national hero. So he himself became a propaganda figure. The Panzer Detachment of what will be the new Totenkopf division will be named in his honour. And the division now, it's in a sense, it didn't miss him. He wasn't indispensable. He'd done his part because the new division, new people were being drafted in, and it would become a far more, let us say, professional unit based on more traditional army models rather than a highly politicized unit. That was semi-professional at
Mm.
best. It's got to be said. And what will be interesting is the division will serve exclusively on the Eastern Front right up until May 1945. He was he ever forgotten? No, he was greatly revered by the men to the very end. He was seen as the father of the division, the man who made it all possible. So yeah, an important figure, but never sort of a anybody who was anywhere near the top table. I think his main contributions, if we like, came before the war, and those contributions are entirely negative in that they all revolve around, sorry, the concentration camp system, especially Dachau. Everywhere that follows, particularly look at Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, all these pre-war camps follow the Dachau model. They follow his doctrine. The guards operate in the way that he told them to operate. That is unrelenting harshness. Have
Mm.
no pity for these people. Now, that harshness will then be translated onto the battlefield. And as we see, it will culminate in atrocities such as the Paradis. And so the reputation of division will be forever tarnished, it has to be said. And for that, he does have to take a lot of the responsibility.
Indeed. So I guess just to close up, a couple of questions. So I guess firstly, given you'd encountered him a few years before writing the book, when you were actually working on the project and writing the book and doing your research, did your impression of him change through that?
It does as you go on because you get to know the person better. I thought I had a good handle on him even before I started the book. But I began to realize it was a far more complicated. I mean, we're all complicated, but in some respects, he reminds me of the Fuhrer himself, Hitler, a man who lived their own personal nightmare, someone who created a whole state that was based on his own nightmare of petty jealousies, of his own personal grievance against the world. These two men had an awful lot in common. They really did. And I didn't realize how deep some of these feelings went. The number of grudges that he had against these people, the extent that he would go to settle scores with people, no matter who these people were. He had fights with a number of regional Gauleiters. He'd even fight with Himmler on several occasions and had to be reprimanded on several occasions. He had fights with several army commanders. There was virtually nobody that he didn't fight with. So that made him a difficult character to write about, but it made him a very interesting one because I thought, how can somebody with so many flaws actually go on to succeed and carve out a niche for themselves? And then I began to realize that he wasn't that unusual in that the early SS, particularly, the SS pre National Socialist takeover of power, it was full of characters like Eicke. These sorts of freebooters, these, we're talking about unthinking thugs here, though. We're talking about people, a lot of them, like Ike, had a, petty bourgeois background, quite a, a decent, solid background, came from good families, but they all had an axe to grind for various reasons. They'd all been social failures for various reasons. And what the SS would do is they would take these misfits and give them a chance to make something of themselves. Heydrich is a great example of that, a man who was cashiered from the Navy, outcast in 1931, would be swept up by Himmler, a man for all Himmler's faults. He had very good antennae when it came to picking subordinates. He had an unerring opportunity, unerring ability to pick the right man. For the SS security services, the perfect candidate was Heydrich. For the concentration camps, the perfect candidate was Eicke. And they both, these pair of social misfits, managed to carve out niches for themselves and created their own personal fiefdoms. But wasn't that what Hitler's gangster regime was all about, after all? As I
Right.
like to tell my passengers on tour, don't think of the Third Reich as government as we know it. Think of it as a bunch of mafia dons in a back room, talking about who they're going to sort of take out next and who's going to take over such and such a patch. That's what National Socialism was. They didn't work together, they worked against each other. They made the system chaotic, but it made things move. It
Hmm.
made things move very quickly. I think Eicke was one of the best examples of that. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I think you've definitely even in this talk you've highlighted him so well in terms of, I say, he clearly was a doer, a mover. I think those who read your book will also see that in obviously even greater detail and that added context you give. Obviously various kind of images of him and of related people. So I guess the last question, we've alluded to this earlier, but as a bit of a spoiler, what have you got planned for your next book or books?
Wow. The next book's already started. And again, it's one of those stories. I was on a battlefield tour, which I was leading, and we were sat in the courtyard of Colditz, as you do, having a little break. And one of the passengers came and sat next to me. His name was Steve, and he began telling me about his collection. He has a huge collection of POW journals, logbooks, you name it. And I was saying, has any of this stuff been published, Steve? He said, no, none of it's been published. So, of course, well, we really should do something with this. Would you like to do something? He said, yes, but I don't know how to go about it. Well, it's strangely enough, I know these two guys who, they've got this, relatively new, upcoming publishing company. And I think I got onto you within a week. And I think we signed a contract a week later. And I think this was back in April, May. And I'm up to, I think I'm up to about 20,000 words in the book so far. And it's really going to be something to showcase a lot of Steve's amazing photographs,
Hmm.
many of which have never been seen before. Journal articles which include drawings which have never been seen before. There's actually a drawing of the theatre at North Camp. I've never seen one before. There's some amazing stuff there as well. Another person that stepped in to help, who actually is a great hero of mine, but it's not a history. My other great passion is music, and this is Robert Fripp. So anybody who likes the music, he's the guitarist with King Crimson. Now his uncle Alfie was a prisoner at Stalag Luft 3, the longest serving British POW, right through from October 39 to May 45. And so he's sent me over 100 images as well, some of which haven't been published. So it's going to be a great project. And I think it's going to cause a stir amongst the community. And there is quite a big one out there. And of course, one thing leads to another. And Steve also has a very, very large collection of escape and evasion equipment. So I can see already a follow-up book in the offing. I
Perfect.
just need somebody to publish it. Do you know anybody?
I think I've got someone in mind. But no, thank you again, David. So obviously with this book, Theodor Eicke already out there, for those that are willing to get a copy, head over to our website, barnformpublishing.co.uk.
Yeah.
Or indeed the main place you'd expect, Amazon is always there, but we'd appreciate if you come to us first. So yeah, thanks again, David, and we'll leave it there.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much, Ashley and Neil, and thank you very much for all that joined tonight. It's great to have your support as well. It's very much appreciated.
Brilliant. Thank you.